So we're already getting a ton of great questions. So I'm gonna get rolling here with the introduction, and we'll let her fly. So welcome everybody to MidCurrent Interviews Live. This is actually the first episode of Interviews Live that we've done. So apologize for any mistakes in advance, but this is a chance for us to talk to notable people who fly fish and give you a chance to ask them questions live. You can always ask them questions after the show, of course, if you'd like to, by emailing us. But I'm Marshall Cutchin, publisher of MidCurrent. And today we're joined by Devin Olsen, who has been a competition angler from the early 2000s. He's widely recognized as one of the top U.S. experts on euro-nymphing. His recently released book and DVDs have become very popular sources of information and inspiration for fly fishers who want to get into tightline nymphing and similar techniques. Devin holds a bachelor degree in ecology and master's degree in fisheries science, and he spent 3 years working as a fisheries biologist before starting Tactical Fly Fisher, his website and retail shop, in 2017. We asked Devin to join us today to help us try to demystify euro-nymphing. We'll ask him to try to simplify or present in easy to understand ways or terms what is an entirely new way of fly fishing for a lot of anglers. Before we start, we want to remind you that you're watching live on Facebook. If you are watching live on Facebook, you can ask Devin questions or add comments in the chat window. You can also invite your Facebook friends to join us while we're live. And if you're watching a recorded version, welcome to those folks too. So Devin, what's it like being a pioneer of what a lot of people think of as an entirely new way of fly fishing?
Well, I wouldn't describe myself as a pioneer of the technique itself. Really, I've just been fortunate in that I started competing early on in life and met some people who were already involved doing this and had a chance to learn from them and get interested in what, frankly, a lot of the Europeans were doing, since they were doing it a lot better than us, and chase it. And so I really haven't invented or come up with most of this. I've chased refinement within it and maybe had some personal discoveries there. But most of what I've been able to do is just had a chance to share it with folks through our videos and my blog and the shop and my book and things like that. So it's been a pretty exciting ride. Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, I never thought I'd be doing this. I thought I was going to still be electrofishing and running traps and doing and running statistics on fish populations and trying to make management decisions. But this kind of fell in my lap, and so here we are.
You would have to admit, though, I think that the development of euro-nymphing or variations on Euro style or Spanish style, Polish style, tightline nymphing have been pretty rapid, right? I mean, the changes have all really happened in the last 10 or 20 years, right? And it's really come, it's I don't know what's the phrase I'm looking for, but it's just gone at light speed from what were very traditional techniques to techniques that are you're constantly improvising and improving on an almost seasonal daily basis, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, when we shot Modern Nymphing, our first film back in 2016, pretty much the way that I was fishing for that film, I'd already stopped doing. It was meant to be more of an introductory type film to get people an idea of the foundations of it, but I was already abandoning many of the things that I was showing in the film and moving on. And even just in the last, I mean, in some of the questions you sent me, I was thinking about it, and it's amazing what has happened on like a 6-month timeline for me over the last 4 to 5 years. Every 6 months, through continuing to work on things, there's some other light bulb that goes off that, oh, well, what if I try this? Let's see what happens. And what if I try that, and it's just continual attempts at refinement. And I find things that help and things that don't. And you add those little details to the game to try and get better and better. And it has been at light speed. I mean, 2003, about, from what I know, and then the Spanish World Championships is when the first kind of long French leaders came about at the actual World Championships. And it wasn't long after that it leapt even further forward than that within a few years to a lot of what's going on now. So there's been a lot of rapid development.
And before we get any further, can you think of a moment where you saw what was happening with this technique? Was it the first competition you entered where you thought to yourself, oh my gosh, I've got to change everything I'm doing, or this is like eureka moment?
Well, we kind of talked about it a little bit in the first Modern Nymphing right at the intro. So when I first got started in 2005, that was when I began working at a fly shop that both Ryan Barnes and Lance Egan were working at, and they were both Team USA members. And so they were, talking about the things they were doing, and I, of course, went out fishing with them and was excited about it. But they were using, what we'd been taught by our team coach at the time, who was Lottie, and he was still mainly using the techniques that he used to win the World Championships back in the late 80s. And so everybody else was, doing this, zooming away, and we were just trying to even stay legal, because all of us were indicator nymphers coming from traditional American style ways of nymphing. And so frankly, for the first couple of years, I did a little bit of what would have been called Polish or kind of pre-check nymphing, with short leaders and heavy flies and all that. But it never really convinced me that it was the best way to fish in a lot of instances. And I still did a lot of fishing early on, pretty much trying to approximate the indicator leaders that I'd been using, but just do it with a dry dropper rig and a dry fly that was full of poly yarn or something like that to act like an indicator and hold up enough weight. And I was successful in a lot of those early tournaments doing that, and I won a lot of sessions and a few comps, but that's because nobody else is doing anything better in our local scene because we hadn't figured it out. And it was 2007 when Lance came back from Finland. He came back with a book that a lot of people would know. It's called Check Nymph and Other Related Fly Fishing Methods by Carol Kravanek. And really the whole book was mainly about older style check nymphing and a lot of the cool patterns and stuff that they'd use that were all check style nymphs and everything. But there was 2 pages within the book that had some French leader formulas, and they were drastically different than anything else that he was talking about in the rest of the book. And he gave no real advice on how to fish them or anything. It was just, hey, these are what some of the current masters really are using, And so Lance started playing with them on his own. And he called me up and said, hey, you need to come try this with me. And that's when we did that H Creek experiment that I talk about, where we started comparing, dry fly, dry dropper, and then this leader through the same spots on a little stream and starting to see the big difference.
Right. So would you say that was the biggest sort of pivot point where you went from an indicator to a sighter, or just whatever?
Well, I'd already gone away from indicators just because I had to from a competition perspective, but that's when I at least started transitioning away from approximating an indicator rig with dry fly and trying to truly go rely on a leader-based strike detection method, I guess, if you want to think of it that way.
Sure. That's the way I think of it, but it may not be the right way to think of it. So, but it is an eye opener, when you use a sighter, and maybe you've even gone past this point, but it's an eye opener when you are, leading a fly through a run, and you're really focusing on that sighter to tell you what's happening, and some instinct too. There's a lot of I think expectation and speed of reaction that people are not used to in traditional fly fishing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I think about it. I think one of the things that's different for most folks is that you don't have time to take off when you're euro-nymphing. Like there's no 10 seconds in the drift where you can take a break and take your mind off of it and not worry about what your rod and your hands and everything are doing. You are on the whole time. So it takes a lot of focus.
Right.
And people who have that capability do really well with it. And
yeah. So no,
for others, it takes some adjustment.
No dropping your fly upstream and then taking a bite of sandwich. And
no.
Right.
No, you got to be controlling. You are the controller in the situation, right? There's no intermediary. You're not relying on an indicator to be between you and your flies and to really do most of the control. And you're just kind of trying to set up slack to let your indicator do what it wants to do in the current that it's in. You are the one that's controlling how your flies drift. And so if you do something, it's good or bad. There's really no in between. You're either helping the situation or you're hurting it, but you can't take a break during a drift and not have an effect on what your flies are doing.
Right. And you're not even done when the drift is over, right? I mean, one of the most helpful tips I got, I think it was from your DVD, was, when you pick up, set, right? When you finish that drift, you're
either into a backcast or a hook set. It's really the same thing.
Yeah.
Either way, you accomplish the same task.
Yeah. So before we get into specific questions, and we've got some really great questions coming up here, can you give us a few things that every fly angler who wants to learn euro-nymphing should understand? Whether that's a misconception about what euro-nymphing is and is not, or just tips for conceptually what the way you need to think and how that's different from traditional fly fishing.
Well, maybe let's go back and let's just cover a couple of the basics first of what it is and what you're using, and then I'll get into some of those 5 things or misconceptions, stuff like that. So let's set it up first. Really, what you're talking about when you're euro-nymphing is a really long leader. Okay, so we're talking about a leader that's somewhere around twice the length of your rod. And your rod is also longer. Typically, we're using a 10 or a 10.5 or even 11-foot rod, usually around a 2 to a 3 weight for most of the things we're doing. But that's a little bit misleading to most folks because they think, oh, it's a 2 or a 3 weight. I'm only going to be able to land, 8-inch fish on it. But they don't realize that this obviously isn't exactly what's going on. But it's almost like having a 9-foot 5 weight and then extending the length and the taper another foot and a half to get that 3 weight loading in the tip, but you still have pretty much all the power and the fighting ability in the lower half of the rod that you would with the shorter, heavier weight rod. So you've got a long light rod and a leader that is about twice the length of that. You don't have anything that's floating your nymphs. There's nothing suspending it there, at least in a true Euro style. You can grease and float your cider, which we'll talk about in a second, but you don't have a device like a foam indicator or something like that, or a thingamabob or anything that's floating your nymphs. You are what's controlling the drift of your nymphs. So within that leader, there's who knows how many configurations of leaders there are out there. There's lots of commercially pre-built ones. There's hand-tied ones like we sell in the shop that are made for people who just want to get something to get them going and get used to it, all the way down to really micro style leaders that pretty much have no butt section and are just flat level micro indicator mono for the whole leader. So there's lots of different variations there, but really in a typical euro-nymph leader, you're going to have some sort of butt section. Usually it's different material, and then a cider at the end before your tippet. So you might have something like 12 feet of 15 or 20 pound maxima, and then 3 feet of either more maxima or amnesia. Is a lot of what I've suggested people use in between as kind of a transition material that's still bright so they can see it if their cider's on the water, but also helps to transition some of that energy from the stiff chameleon down to the cider. And then your cider itself when we talk about ciders and euro-nymphing, that is your new indicator. And all a cider is just fluorescent indicator mono that's built into the leader. So there's lots of products out there that are pre-made for this. Just about every Tippet manufacturer these days has cider material. Cortland has indicator mono. Rio has indicator Tippet. So does Umpqua. Scientific Anglers, pretty much all of them now have, and it's just pre-dyed fluorescent indicator material that's regular nylon. It's part of your leader. And that's what you're watching as you're making your drifts. And then at the end of that, most people will have a Tippet ring, which is just kind of a little micro steel ring that you can tie your cider to so that you don't have a clunky junction between that and your Tippet. Because a lot of times you're going to go from a fairly thick cider material straight to 5X or 6X or even 7X Tippet, and they just don't join together well. So having a Tippet ring there will improve that connection, but also make it so that you don't chew up your cider every time you want to add some more Tippet. Mm-hmm. And then so that if you're looking at it at that point, we're maybe like 16 feet of the leader at this point, 16, 17 feet. And you're just going to add Tippet from there and straight Tippet. I don't want any knots below the surface other than what I have to have. So I don't add taper to my Tippet or anything like that. I just want pure, straight, thin Tippet that sinks as rapidly as possible and drifts as best as possible under the current because it catches the least amount of that current once it's submerged. So if you're going to make a multi-fly rig, then you might have 3 or 4 feet to your first fly, and then you add another couple feet to your second fly. And typically we will add that dropper fly on a tag. So we'll tie a surgeon's knot 6 or 7 inches up the Tippet that's already coming from the leader, and place the surgeon's knot there so that the waist tag that's facing down ends up becoming your dropper tag. And then you've got 6 or 7 inches to play with, there to attach a dropper fly if you want. And then that Tippet that's down below is where your point fly is going to go. But that's the basic leader. That's the basic rod. There's lots of other details we could get into there, but that's that's how you're set up.
Sure.
What's different about that now is that typically you're going to make a cast, and if it's just a up and across type technique, the sort of base euro-nymphing strategy, you're going to make a cast and hopefully you're going to stop your rod high enough that your cider pretty much is off the water right from the get-go. Or if you're making a longer cast, it might float for a little bit, but you're smoothly bringing slack up so that cider lifts off the water very gently. And then you're holding that cider off of the water through the drift. And the angle that you manipulate the cider with, whether it's further downstream or more vertical, something like that, that is what's going to control the speed of your nymphs relative to the water that they're in. So that's kind of your determinant there. If you have a cider angle that's shallow, I'll see if I can actually fit it in the camera here. So if I have a cider angle that's shallow like this, if that's downstream, and I'm leading it like that, then I'm probably speeding up my flies faster, or fishing them faster relative to the speed that the nymphs themselves are in, not the surface of the water, but the water that the nymphs themselves are in. I'm going faster than what that current is by at least a little bit. Whereas if you get more vertical with your cider like this, you're essentially letting the nymphs move at will, let them take the speed of the current they're in, and you're approximating more of what you'd call a dead drift at that point. And you as the angler get to decide what that angle is. You can manipulate that angle to speed up or slow down your flies, to let them sink, or to hold them up above the bottom. You can also lift the cider or drop the cider to have that same effect. But generally, you're going to want the cider out of the water so that it doesn't catch that surface current and get yanked downstream faster than it would otherwise, since it's usually a lot more thick and will have a lot more drag than that Tippet that's below the surface.
Great. Yeah, so that was actually a question that our friend Phil Monahan asked. You can talk about what it means to lead the flies through the drift. You kind of described it there, but you're essentially talking about that angle changing the speed at which the flies move.
Yep. So if you're at a shallower downstream angle, you're speeding up the flies. And if you're getting closer and closer to a vertical angle, then you're slowing down the flies or more just letting them go at the speed of the current they're in.
Gotcha. So want to talk about misconceptions, what people think of? I know you've...
Oh, sure. Yeah, we'll go there. And then maybe we'll talk about 5 things that maybe anglers should understand about euro-nymphing. So one of my, I have a few pet peeves. I didn't list many of them here, but there's a couple misconceptions that I think. First, I've heard, we even were accused in writing of this in a paper once after national championships by one of the local fly shop owners who said that all we were doing was dragging the bottom and snagging fish. We weren't even getting fish to take our flies. We were just foul hooking them. And if anybody has ever watched me or any other person euro-nymph, you'll know that if that's what you're doing, then you're losing your entire fly box of flies within about 10 minutes. Because if you're dragging the bottom and your flies are at the end of your leader, you're going to be contacting all sorts of things that will take those flies and not give them back to you. So that's just not true. My flies are in the drift. The thing that one of the biggest misconceptions there is that you should be bouncing bottom. I think that comes a lot from people who've fished bounce rigs or drop shot rigs where they have split shot on the end of their leader and then they have unweighted flies up above. And so they're used to being able to just bounce along however they want and their split shot contact the bottom. And if they hook something, they don't really care because they just break the split shot off and they usually get their flies back. In this case, we're using the flies as our split shot. And there are some very definite benefits to doing that. You get direct contact to your fly. So the minute a fish takes your fly, you get a much more immediate reaction from on your leader that tells you, I just had a fish take. So your strike detection is vastly improved. And if you ask me, your drift is as well, because it's that point of weight that's controlling the drift. If the split shot is controlling drift that your flies are above, you're basically actually artificially slowing them down from the current that they're in themselves. So at this point, the flies themselves and then your sider angle, like I was talking about, that's what's controlling your drift. And so if you can get your flies down in that current where the fish are at and let it go at that speed, then you get a better drift. But it is in the drift. We're not fishing for benthic feeding fish here. We're not fishing for suckers that are grabbing down on the bottom and rooting up things. We're fishing for trout, which in general are drift feeders, which means that they look forward or up for food items that are coming towards them, and then they go and grab it. So my nymphs are very rarely, in fact, never, with the way that I fish, I'm never dragging bottom, never ticking bottom, never doing anything like that. If I tick bottom more than once every 4 or 5 casts and towards the end of the drift, then I'm changing something. I'm lightening up my flies. I'm shortening my tippet. I'm shortening my cast. Something. I'm having my flies in the drift, not on the bottom. So snagging fish actually happens a lot less with euro-nymphing simply because your strike detection is so immediate and you don't have that delay with all that slack in between you and your indicator, so that when you finally set the hook, the fish has already fat the hook and you foul hook it under the belly or something like that with your other flies. So that's a common misconception. Another one is that you have to have really large, heavy anchor flies. Everybody always asks me, what are your top anchor flies? And that's probably one of my least favorite terms. I absolutely despise that term anchor fly because it gives a total misconception what you probably need when it comes to euro-nymphing. If I have something that is as heavy as an anchor, I'd better be fishing water that's 5 or 6 feet deep and has a lot of velocity. Because if I'm fishing that amount of weight and anything less than that, then I'm doing something wrong. Most of the flies that I fish, at least around here, it's different during runoff or just post runoff when I've still got a lot of volume in the water and a lot of depth. But for general typical conditions around my home waters, which are smaller, to be honest, so it's not going to apply to a really large river where you're dealing with a lot of depth and velocity. But for most of my walkable, wadeable waters around here, I'm fishing size 14 to 20 flies. Very similar size as what most people would do with, and usually 3.5 millimeter and smaller beads. This winter, I spent a lot of the winter fishing with nothing but 2mm flies. Hardly any weight at all compared to what most people would think. I did a lot of fishing with a single 2mm bead in a lot of the skinny water that I had all winter long. So this idea of that you have to have anchor flies to euro-nymph is just not true in most situations. I still have some flies, the bottom row or 2 rows of each one of my boxes that are those weights, but those are vast, those are very much the minority of the flies that I fish. I only pull them out for specific circumstances where they're really required. So if you're, bouncing the bottom once again, because you're fishing really heavy flies, then you could be doing better. And then the last one I wanted to talk about, as far as a misconception, is one of my least favorite questions that I get asked by customers in the shop is they'll have a list of, a couple rods, or they'll ask me just point blank, which one is the most sensitive rod in this price bracket? And I absolutely want to yell and scream and be like, you're thinking about this wrong. If you're wanting a rod that's super sensitive, you are waiting until you're feeling the strike. If you're waiting until you're feeling the strike, you are missing most of your strikes. This is not, yes, you will feel strikes. And especially if you, as I'll talk about in a second here, you will feel strikes if you rig a certain way more than others. But it should be simultaneous, if nothing else, to you seeing the strike. You should not be feeling the strike regularly before you're seeing something happen. So this is a visual-based method. Stop worrying about which rod is most sensitive, because if you're worrying about that, you're worrying about the wrong thing. You should be worrying about learning to spot strikes sooner and not rely upon the sensitivity of the rod. If you really want to get a rig that's more sensitive, yes, there are sensitivity differences between rods, and generally higher end rods that have better recovery speed and have less weight and better dampening and all those things are going to be more sensitive. But the leader that you fish will have far more effect on the sensitivity of your rig and the rod well. Going to a much thinner leader system that has less mass and therefore less sag and gets you better connection directly to your flies, that's really what's going to make things sensitive for you, as opposed to a rod that is going to transmit, whatever feeling of a take you think you should be having to your hand. So just a couple misconceptions or pet peeves there, I guess.
No, that's great. They actually answered a few questions that our viewers had while you were talking there. So that's terrific. Just one comment about distribution of this concept across the United States. I noticed when I was fishing in Montana last summer, there were very few fly shops that actually carried any jig style flies, which really surprised me. Do you sense that that Euro style nymphing is more of a regional phenomenon right now, or do you think it's something that could spread to the East Coast and places?
Well, actually, I think the East Coast is originally where it really took off to begin with. To be 100% honest, it took off in areas where there were competitors, and where they were able to share it with people, and people had kind of word of mouth or firsthand evidence of, hey, these guys are catching a lot of fish. How are they doing it? So then they tell their buddies, and they tell their buddies, and they tell their buddies. And in some areas like up around Pennsylvania, where you already had sort of that high stick, Joe Humphreys, George Harvey, style that a lot of them were used to. It wasn't a large leap for a lot of people there to go from doing that to a specific Euro leader and weighted flies. A lot of the concepts were similar. They just had to change a little bit of the rigging and approximate it that way. So it took off there, I think, there and then down in around North Carolina and the Southeast first, because that's where the highest number of competitors were that were doing this early on. The West, I would say, especially in the tailwater crazy areas and up in Montana and everything to begin with, was quite reluctant. There were a few of us from the team that were here in Colorado and Utah and elsewhere that were fishing this way, but people didn't buy into it, mainly because they thought there's no way we'll catch fish in tailwaters on anything besides 22 flies and my thingamabobber. And so it took a while and some sort of instructional material that showed how effective it was for people in the West to grasp it. And that's happened and happening now. It's far more popular locally in the Rockies and in California than it was before, as more and more shops and more people have gravitated towards it. But there's still places that tend to lag behind. And it's, in the end, we as fly fishers have pretty strong egos. I think a lot of us would admit to that. We all think that we know what we're doing. We all think that we have a lot of things figured out, quote unquote, and that we're being successful in our own way. And, many of us are right in that affirmation, but there's also there's a lot to be learned for any of us out there. And some of us are reticent to do that at first until we have to, frankly, because we're shown that we have to. So there's certain areas where there just hasn't been many competitors. And I think those areas are the areas that have been furthest behind in the acceptance of this. But as it's gained more and more attention over the last few years, even the furthest outposts at this point at least know about it, even if they haven't full-on accepted it yet.
Yeah. I compare euro-nymphing in some ways to tenkara fishing, in the sense that even if you decide that you don't want to make that your primary way of fishing, if you try it, it teaches you a heck of a lot about drift and its impact on fish behavior, and the importance of what you're paying attention to. Anybody who's euro-nymphed for a while has the experience of having gone behind somebody else, or you've experimented this with these ideas directly, because you're more of you've got an engineer's mind and you're thinking in terms of numbers, but you can fish behind somebody who's fished with a dry dropper or an indicator, and catch fish that they didn't even know were there. And the same thing can be true with the tenkara fly, which is naturally drifted on also a very long, light leader. You can see how the fish behave when they're seeing perfectly natural drift that an indicator can get in the way of, as an example. So I don't know if you agree with that, but I think for that reason alone, it's worth experimenting with jig flies and the leader setup that you described, just to kind of see what it's all about. Whether you decide not to do most of your fishing that way, it's a really good idea. Time for some questions. Are you ready to jump into some
Sure.
questions? Yeah, it might be a little bit random here, so we might be jumping back and forth. Mike Martin asks, any tips for casting a 30-foot leader?
Well, couple of things there. I'm just going to refer you to some things that I already have out there. So I have a YouTube channel for tactical fly fisher, and at least 3 of the recent videos that I did were all on casting. One of them was on just the basic learning how to rotate your wrist and use a wrist-based type cast for this, which that's one of the best ways to improve your euro-nymph cast. And then also in our second film, Modern Nymphing Elevated, I spent the first 20 minutes of that film doing nothing but casting instruction and trying to teach people how to get better at casting this type of rig. In general, I would say use more wrist, less. You don't want to be moving your shoulder around like that. It's a wrist-based cast. There's the camera. It's backwards. It's a wrist-based cast. So if you're coming from, trying to force yourself to have a relatively still wrist to form tight loops for dry flies and things like that, you're going to have to adjust and be willing to go back and forth. I mean, I still cast lots of dry flies. I still do lots of bomb casts on lakes, things like that. So I'm still moving back and forth between traditional fly casting this all the time. You have to learn to be flexible and know when different movements are called for. The other thing is that most people have a really underpowered back cast, which they try and compensate with an overpowered forward cast with this rig. You don't have a fly line that sends a signal to your hand that things have turned over in the back so you can make your forward cast, right? So you really have to be, you have to use a shorter stroke with more energy or more speed in the actual stroke, but you still have to wait and let those flies turn on them in the back cast. Normally when I've taught people, they don't have enough speed or energy in their back cast, so their fly never turns over behind them. So when they go to make that forward cast, the flies don't go anywhere where they're trying to put them. The other thing I would say is one of the things that drives me nuts, another pet peeve of mine, and Lance too, we talk about this all the time. When we've taught people this method, we'll have a very specific spot we're trying to get them to cast, and they don't even get it in there for 20 casts. And then finally on the 20th cast, when they actually get it to where I want them to go, they catch a fish immediately. Or they've spooked that fish already, from having 20 bad casts that hit on their head. But they don't put any effort into learning how to cast. I mean, if you went and you talked to 10 golfers and you asked every single one of them how many times they'd spent, hitting balls on the driving range in the last year, every one of them would have an answer that was more than 0. But very rarely do you get fly casters that you ask, how much time did you spend in your park or in your backyard, practicing casting in the last year? There's just not a lot of them doing it. And the average fly fisherman out there is a poor caster. And I'm not trying to be rude. It's just the reality of it. There's not a lot of effort that gets put into becoming a better fly caster by most fly anglers because they want to spend their time fly fishing out on the river and enjoying things, but they haven't actually done the work aside from the river to make that time more valuable to them. So you need to put some effort in. Mm-hmm. And what, even if you want to do your practice on the river, that's fine, but you'd better form a target on the river and then take some time out of your day to be willing to repeatedly hit that and be very accurate. Euro-nymph casting, it's not about casting distance. We're not making tournament casts here. We're trying to control casts in the 10 to 30 foot range, but I want to be able to hit a dinner plate or smaller size target on my first cast. And if I can do that, I will catch a lot of fish because your first cast is always your best cast. And if you can get it there right away, not mess around 4 inches, back and forth either side, then you're going to get a fish that is unaware of your presence, is willing to take very, very quickly most of the time. But if you have to spend, a bunch of different casts trying to get it into that one spot, a lot of times you think that you've shown it to that fish and you didn't. I've watched the behavior of so many fish this winter when I was 2 inches to the side of where I wanted to be and they didn't even look. But the minute I got it exactly in front of that fish, took it right away. And so you have to just put in some effort and learn how to cast this rig. Anybody can do it. Like nobody out there who's listening to this call is not capable of making a euro-nymph cast, but it takes a little bit of practice and it takes dedicated effort. And in the end, you get what you put, you get out of it what you put into it.
Sure.
Just like any other fly fishing method.
Sure. We got a comment. It's actually not a question, but I'll let you reply to it. I use a micro swivel instead of a tippet ring in my sighter. It really reduces my tag fly line wrap around my point fly. And maybe you could say something about either rigging or
well, if that works for Claudine, that's great. Here's the reason I wouldn't do that. One of the things that I've tried to do more and more over the last couple of years is reduce the amount of mass that is in any part of my leader. Because the less mass I have, the less sag I have, and the less sag I have, the less weight I actually have to fish in my flies in order to accomplish the same thing. Even with the smallest micro swivels I know of out there, there is significantly more mass in them than there is in a single 1.5 or 2 millimeter tippet ring. And so if you try and lift that off of the water, it's going to want to go back to where it came from, right? Gravity is going to pull it down. And so in order to keep it suspended off of the water, you have to offset that by having more weight in your flies, which means you have to fish larger and heavier flies than you would otherwise. So if you can reduce any of the mass up the leader, in the butt section, in the cider, or what the cider is connected to your tippet with, then it becomes easier and easier to fish less weight and have your cider off of the water where it needs to be getting the drift that you need. And if that swivel goes under the water, it's also got a lot of surface area. And that surface area catches that current at the top of the river, which is never the same speed as the water that is down where your flies are at. If it's catching that current, it is affecting your drift, almost like having a little micro indicator on your leader. So I never want anything, unless I'm floating the cider and fishing it upstream, greased or something like that. That's a little bit different. But in a typical euro-nymph drift, I don't want anything but tippet below the surface. And so having extra mass in the leader makes that harder to do and makes you have to fish heavier flies to accomplish the same task.
I'll put this up for a minute. We'll get rid of it in a second because it's covering everybody up. But Carmine Ricciardi, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, says, when transitioning from nymphing to using a dry dropper on the micro thin leader while you transition from fishing slower water types to faster water types, like a run with slow water close to you and fast in the middle, do you find yourself adjusting the depth of the dropper? Or do you just leave the length between flies the same, about 20 inches, and maybe go to a lighter weight fly?
Well, there's a lot of it depends in answer to that question, mainly on just the depth and the speed of whichever water type you're going in between. One of the things that I do a lot, which a lot of people don't like and aren't willing to do, is I carry multiple rods with me most days when I'm out on the water because I want to minimize the amount of rig changes that I have and try and be more efficient that way. So it's very common for me to take 2 or 3 rods in a typical recreational day of fishing for me. And then in a tournament, I might have 4 or 5 rigged up during every session. To me, the hassle is less to move the rod than it is to be repeatedly re-rigging all the time. So I usually, in that case, for myself, I'll have a separate rod still with the microliter, but it'll be dedicated to a dry dropper. And then I'll have another rod still with a microliter that's dedicated as my nymphing rod for the day. So I'm not swapping back and forth all the time on that. Now, if I was, I would have to analyze the situation and see what length of tippet things called for and what length of, or what weight of fly. So if I'm fishing a dry dropper in a slick or a pool, flatter water before I go nymph ahead of it or something like that. If it's really, really shallow, then you may have to either cut down your tippet or just go to the lightest fly possible. Like I said earlier, I did lots and lots of fishing with a single 2 millimeter nymph this year, and that was both under a dry on that microliter and also just single nymph by itself. And so I would go down to a very lightweight fly to be able to keep it off the bottom in a lot of situations. But at the same time, if it was a pool or a flat that was deeper than that 20 inches that I could get down even with a heavy fly, I'm going to need to add tippet at that point. So whatever situation you find yourself confronted with on the water, one of the things that should be always rolling through your head is, how do I adjust my rigging or my approach, my length of cast, my weight of fly, whatever, all those variables that you can change in your cast, your drift, and your rig to get my nymph where it needs to be in the column to catch the fish. And if you feel like your nymph isn't there, then you need to make some sort of change. And there's lots of changes you can make, but be willing to make that change is, I guess, my somewhat roundabout answer to that question.
Mm-hmm. Chris Preston asks, when I use very fine tippets, I get lots of tangles. Any thoughts on, other than more time on the water, what will teach me to
well, tangle? I guess I'd have to see specifically the situations of when those tangles are happening, but usually tangles are the result of some sort of catastrophic cast. And so if you go back to those materials I talked about, were learning to use a wrist-based cast and an oval-shaped cast so that no matter what, your flies never contact the leader. Many people get tangles when they make a cast that isn't oval shaped. And so when they make the stroke forward or back, their flies end up colliding with some other part of their leader. And in a euro-nymph setting, that's going to happen constantly if you're trying to use a typical fly cast that's not oval shaped. If you will widen that oval and make the stroke oval shaped so that your back cast is below, or your forward cast comes over the top of your back cast, and your flies are going to swing out and away both from your rod and your leader, and you're going to have a lot less tangles. The fine tippet side of things, I actually don't think that you're going to have more or less tangles to a certain extent with fine tippet than you would, one or two sizes heavier, other than you just have reduced stiffness there. But you're still having the same problem or, lack of execution, I guess, with the thicker tippet. It's just kind of saving you because it's stiffer and it comes undone or unraveled a little easier on its own. But if you really focus more on the cast and making that wide open loop or stroke so that your flies don't collide with the rest of your leader, then that'll go away. I mean, other than when I have really at this point, and this isn't, a bragging statement or an arrogant statement. It's just sort of the reality of it. I don't get tangles anymore unless I have something weird happen, like a fish spitting the hook and I can't get my rod out of the way when it flies back at me, or, flies into a tree at that point or something like that. In just a general, cast to cast to drift to cast to drift, my cast is shaped in a way that I just don't have tangles. And that's not above anybody's skill or ability. It's just learning to be repeatable in your casting movements so that nothing is spastic and it's all controlled and in a shape that will avoid that happening.
Clark Ross asks, what size typically tippet do you fish? He says, meaning break down below the cider. I think you already broke down what you did.
Yep. So below the cider, I only have straight tippet. Like I said, I never taper anything. And 5X would be big. I don't really fish 5X or bigger unless I know I'm running into fish over 20 inches all day. 6X is kind of run of the mill. If I'm new to a river and I don't, know what's there, I feel pretty comfortable putting on 6X and handling most situations. And then if I'm in techier situations, or like during the middle of tournaments, things like that, I pretty much always go to 7X, where I'm willing maybe to have a few more breakoffs if I can convince a few more fish to eat. So I might lose a few flies at the bottom of the river on 7X more than I would with 6X, but each time you drop down and tip it, you'll have noticeable changes in the sink rate and in the drift speed of your flies. So what I would say to anybody, unless you're fishing 6X or 7X, if you're above that, drop down a size and get used to it, and then see where you're at there, and then drop down another size and get used to it as much as you can. Because one of the cool things about having a Euro rod is that you have a lot of leverage, like I said, but that softer tip gives you a lot of tipper protection. So you can land some really large fish without stressing them, without playing them, for a long time, because you take out that shock value that ends up breaking tippet most of the time anyway. So you can land some pretty darn big fish, without a problem and in quick manner on 6X or 7X tippet if you learn how to fish or fight your fish correctly. But as far as rigging, like I say, it's just all straight tippet below that. And then I might have, if you look into our latest video, I talk about it in adaptive fly fishing, where I'm at now as far as being able to adjust the length of my tippet with a mobile sider through the use of indicator wax. But if you're going with a set sider and a set tippet length, try and approximate somewhere around 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water, the average water that you're fishing from your sider to your point fly. And then, if you have to make changes from there, you can. But a lot of times you can approximate it there and then just adjust the weight of your flies and or the angle of your sider and the height of your sider to do most of the rest of the adjustment that you need for depth.
Philip Quattrini says, when you're fishing further away, maybe because you couldn't wade out any further, Do you let the cider go into the water? Do you float it? Do you put an indicator on?
It depends upon the leader again. So if I'm fishing a microliter, one of the great things about a microliter is that I can fish a lot further away. And if I can't, there's, at least in small to medium sized rivers, it's not very often that I can't wade close enough to fish a microliter off of the water, even at distance. If I'm fishing a standard, 20 pound or 15 pound butt section and I get more sag, then yeah, you're going to have to either fish more weight to keep your cider off the water or float it or put a dry fly on. In a lot of situations, if I really need to suspend flies at distance away from me, I just go straight to a dry dropper rig. But I'll usually still do it on a euro-nymph leader. And that way I don't have to mend it. I can still high stick the leader off to the point of the dry fly, usually anyway, most of the time. And then I get really kind of impeccable drifts at distance that way.
Clark Ross asks, you mentioned the term microliter several times. Can you define what you mean?
So if you look in my book or in Adaptive Fly Fishing, I define it pretty explicitly, but it's basically a leader where the entire euro leader from the fly line to the tippet ring is very small bicolor. So 3X or 4X bicolor. There's no butt section, no taper, nothing like that. It's just all small or micro.
John Dacre asked, do you have a good system for carrying multiple rods, or is it just basically carrying them, putting them down, going back?
A little bit of both. So if it's a small river, I'll usually just put them down on the bank and go back and get them. Mainly because at that point, it's not that hard to go back to the bank on a small river, and I'm not, waiting 50 yards out and then having to go back and get the rod and move it and whatever. But I do have an O-Pros third, I think they call it a third hand rod carrier, that I have attached to my hip pack. And that works pretty well. It takes some getting used to make casts without, hitting your rod behind you. Even if the cool thing about that rod carrier is that it has a tilt on it where you can rotate the rod tip up or down. So you can kind of get it out of the way, but sometimes you're still going to have a little bit of an accident, I would assume. I still do, where I run my rods into each other, especially on a hook set or something like that. So it's helpful, but not perfect. The other thing you can do is if you wear a vest or some sort of chest pack, you can take your other rod and just put it down your waders and point the rod tip up, and either a lot of times it'll just stay there. Like I have a lanyard that I'll thread through, and the lanyard kind of keeps it there. But if you have some vests and chest packs actually have a Velcro strap or some sort of little strap that people don't know that that's what it's for, but it is. So you could look on your specific bag and see if that's the case, or just sew one on or whatever. But a lot of times if you put it in behind your chest pack and just put it down your waders, you can tilt your rod up and carry it with you. And then you just got to be careful once again that when you make your cast, you're staying away from your rod tip. And so normally in that case, what I'll do is if I'm casting over my right shoulder, I'll tilt the rod to the left so it's away from that shoulder. And if I'm casting over my left shoulder, then I'll tilt the rod back to the right so that it stays away from me there.
Steve White says, in your book, you said to use the least amount of tippet going to your first fly. So are you trying to match the depth with just that first fly and then adding your 24 inches or whatever for your second fly? And do you think the modular nymph leader is something I can switch to? Can you make the modular leader a 12 or 15 pound butt section?
So first part of that question, yeah, that's probably a good way to think about it, matching the depth of the water with your first fly and then just adding, 24 inches for the second. That would get you there. Or you can try and do more like what I was saying, where you just sort of approximate 1.5 or 2 times the depth of the water to your second fly. Really what I'm trying to get at and what I wrote there is don't use too much tippet. Don't use more than you need, because the more tippet that you have below the water, the less connection you have with your flies, so your strike detection is reduced, and the more tippet you have below the water, the more surface area you have for different currents to catch that tippet and pull on it in one way or another. So if you can reduce that length of tippet under the water, there's less drag, really, is what it boils down to. So the shorter you can get and still get to the depth that you need to, the better your drifts are going to be. So you can manipulate that, try changing it however you want so that it makes the most sense. And you may have to actually, if you fish pretty short tippet, you may need a heavier point fly than if you had longer tippet. So you have to factor that in. But I would say think about it more if you know that you're getting into the zone by what I call the downshift. So come back to that. If you either get a downshift or if you're ticking bottom once every 4 or 5 casts towards the end of your drift, then you're probably where you need to be with your tippet length and your weight of your flies. If you're never having that happen, never ticking, then you probably need some more weight or some more tippet length. Or if you are constantly touching bottom and early on in the drift, then you need to either take off some weight or reduce your tippet length. But if you go to that 1.5 to 2 times the depth of the water, that's a good place to start. And then what you want to be seeing, as far one of the other questions I get a lot is, how do I know when I have the right amount of weight? Right. So if you've made a cast and somewhere in about a third of the way to half of the way into the drift, you'll get a very perceivable slowdown in your rig, and it's really it's usually just because your flies have gone down through the column and they hit that slower water that's near the bottom, and so they slow down on their own. And so they kind of pull back on your rig. Your rig tightens up a little bit and wants to slow down, and you need to adjust the speed of the way you're following them with your rod tip in order to accommodate that. But that's what I call the downshift, when they've downshifted in speed into that slower part of current. And if that's happening, then you're probably in where you need to be anyways. If that's not happening though, if your flies are just zooming through and you don't ever get a noticeable change in tension or speed of your rig, then you probably need to make some changes to get your flies deeper. I've forgotten the second part of that question.
It had to do with can you make a modular leader with 12 combat sections? So what I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the person that asked. I apologize, but
that was Steve.
Steve.
Okay, so Steve, if you're already feeling comfortable with the basic leader, skip the modular leader. The modular leader is really only necessary if you want to do a dry on 2 droppers. It gives you no benefit beside that. If you want to go to just a dry and a single dropper, or just straight nymphing, then you never need the modular leader. Really what you need to do if you're feeling comfortable with the 20-pound test butt section, you need to just start dropping the diameter of the entire leader. One thing that I did for my dad the last couple times that we've fished together, and it took him 1 or 2 trips to get used to, but instead of having 20-pound butt section to a 12-pound amnesia to a 12,000 cider, like the original formula that I've shared lots and that we have in our shop, I just forced him. I basically gave him a new line and leader and said, here, fish this. And all it was the entire leader was 12,000 cider. And it's a lot less stiff. So it does, it is more challenging to cast at first, but it also has a lot less sag. But it's not all the way down to a micro leader either. It's still got a lot more stiffness than straight 4X for the whole leader does. So it does help cast a little bit. Helps transfer energy and all that, but you get a lot less sag than that 20-pound butt section. So you can fish further away, you can fish with lighter flies, and he's noticed a dramatic increase in his, the betterment of his strike detection, and he's been able to fish in a lot of water with smaller flies than he used to be able to do and still get down.
Great advice. Yeah. Got time for 2 more questions?
I got time.
Okay, great. John McMurrow asks, on a micro, are you still using skaters for your mobile cider mark? It's its fastest way to reposition for the depth of flies. And are you using different leader colors when fishing different seasons, or I guess he means cider colors when fishing different seasons?
Yeah, so John's talking about what I've alluded to earlier in our most recent film, Adaptive Fly Fishing, I talked about using a mobile sighter. You can readjust by applying Scaphar's wax and then wiping it off and applying it somewhere else. And yes, I'm still doing that. And I do believe it's the fastest way to reposition the depth of your flies without, other than just manipulating the angle of your drift. So that's the fastest way, elevating or lowering the sighter and changing the angle of that sighter. That's how you're going to get your fastest manipulation of the depth. But if you need to add or subtract tippet, then yes, that's the fastest way to do that without actually having to tie knots. And then, no, I'm not really changing my colors based on seasons. The only time I change colors, normally in that Scaphar's, I use one of the bright colors to begin with, the orange, the yellow, or the pink. Sometimes I'll change that based on sun, because one sun angle or brightness, or the bottom of the river based on whether it's dark or light. So one of those colors might show up best based on those variables. But typically I run with one of those bright colors. And other than that, the only time I would change is if I feel like I'm fishing someplace where the fish have been hammered and it's really clear, they're really spooky, and I have to just get as stealthy as possible, then I'll go to the white. But the white is definitely not quite as easy to see for me as the brighter colors are. So I don't turn to it unless I absolutely have to.
Steve Lithgow asked, Devin, you and Lance have different preferences. He prefers the heavy fly on the bottom. I notice my casting is more accurate with the heavier fly on top, or equal weight. Am I nuts?
So, Steve, actually, it's the reverse. I'm the one who tends to prefer my heavy fly on the bottom, and it's usually Lance who prefers his heavy fly on the dropper. And you're not nuts. You will have more accurate casting unless you get used to it by having the heavy fly closer to the rod, because then that lighter fly kind of falls in line. So yeah, it'll probably cast more accurate with your heavy fly on the dropper to begin with. But there's other things about having the heavy fly on the dropper or the point that kind of affect the way that we've both settled on how we like to fish them. Lance likes that heavy fly on the dropper mainly so that both of his flies are down in the zone that he wants to be fishing, down near the bottom. Lance also tends to fish more tippet than I do to make that happen so that he can get both of his flies to that depth, whereas I'll usually shorten my tippet, have my heavy fly on the point so that I know I have at least one fly down there, but I also have another fly up in the column for fish that might be suspended. And I also feel that my strike detection is usually better when I have a more direct sort of vertical angle with the tippet that heavy fly on the point provides. Whereas with the heavy fly on the dropper, I feel like you get a little bit of a hinge shape because that heavy fly is sinking faster or at the same speed as that point fly. One other thing I'll say though that I'd like to add in that regard is that one thing I've done a lot more over the last year or so is gone to just fishing a single fly. And that is something that you really can't do very well until you get really small with your leader. So you got to have a really fine leader to fish single fly in a lot of instances, unless you're just in really shallow or slow water. But there are some really definite drift and accuracy benefits of going just to a single fly that I've come to really, really appreciate. So now I'm almost at the point where unless I'm in a larger river, my default is one fly first. And then if I can't get the depth and the drift that I want out of that one fly without going, exorbitantly large or whatever, then I'll go to two flies at that point. But I come to really appreciate the drift properties of one fly enough that that's my default, unless I'm on a larger river.
Okay, last question. This is more of a beginner question. Any tips on how to better see takes on the sighter versus feeling them, aside from just spending more time in the water? I'm relatively new to Euro, and I'm feeling more takes than seeing, so I think I'm missing a lot of takes.
Yeah, that's a hard one. I don't know how to help people spot takes other than to be over their shoulder and say, you should set. You have to get used to micro differences in the way that your leader is behaving. And until you have your own control over that leader to that extent, it's hard to do, because if your rod tip is jumping around because you're not in control of your rod as well, and your drift as well, then your sider is going to be jumping around too, which means your flies are, by the way, and you're not getting a very good drift. But if you're inducing little movements into your leader like that, then it's harder to spot differences. So I would say work on your technique and try and get your drift as smooth and as buttery, just dead still across the water as possible. And then it's easier to spot when it's slowed down, when it's tightened up, when it's jumped. I mean, you're going to probably see the obvious ones where it jumps forward a few inches, but learn to look for things like the sider going from having just a little bit of sag in the sider to going tight. And that's a signal. Learn to watch for it just slowing down or changing direction. So if all of a sudden it goes from facing upstream to rapidly turning downstream, sometimes that can be a take because something is going on in the tippet below the surface that you don't understand because you can't see it, but all of a sudden it tightens up in a weird way, so it'll actually accelerate downstream before going back upstream. Lots of things that you can spot, but really it does just take time to recognize those. Eventually you figure out, even especially once you go to thinner leaders, you'll figure out a lot of times what's a fish and what's bottom, just by the way that it behaves differently. But to begin with, if you see anything at all that looks like something is slowing your flies down, I would say set the hook and put that in the memory bank of, oh, that wasn't a fish or that was. Add all that to your experience and you'll learn to recognize when you need to set the hook down the road.
That's great. Yeah, we've got even more great questions, but unfortunately we're run out of time, and I don't want to take advantage of Devin's generosity today. I know he's got a lot of stuff going on, but if you do have questions that you haven't had answered, you can email them to ask@midcurrent.com, or you can go to tacticalflyfisher.com and reach out to Devin directly there. And I do want to mention, I will mention, Devin's book, Tactical Fly Fishing, is really, in my opinion, the best introduction to euro-nymphing that's out there. He really takes an up-to-date view of how someone can transition from traditional fly fishing into tight liner euro-nymphing. And his DVDs, if you've got a DVD player or a DVD player in your laptop, are really, really great. The first one's called Modern Nymphing. And then the second one, which was released, when was that released, Devin?
2018 was when we released Elevated, and then just a few weeks ago we released Adaptive Fly Fishing.
Okay.
In addition to that, if you don't have a DVD player, we do have them all on Vimeo for digital download and streaming. So you can pick up either the hard copy or the digital copy, and either way it'll work for you. One thing I do want to mention too about adaptive fly fishing in the book, one thing I tried to make it wasn't just to focus on euro-nymphing itself. There is a dedicated chapter on euro-nymphing in the book, but really I'm trying to help people become more holistic anglers, I guess, and adaptable anglers to where they look at any piece of water on the river and they have a strategy for covering it. So it's more water type focus in the book and in the video than anything. The newest video, Adaptive Fly Fishing. There's lots of instances where I talk directly about euro-nymphing approaches in there, but there's lots of others where I show you, or I talk about how that's not the best approach there too. So euro-nymphing, while it is great for lots and lots of water types, there's water types where it's just not the best way to go about it. So I try and give strategies for that as well, so that anybody out there who wants to use strategies that I've learned through competition or otherwise, they have that available too.
And I'll comment too. My son got his own introduction to euro-nymphing from Devin's DVDs and books, and I think he'd tell you they gave him a huge head start in understanding where to go, where to start, where to go, and how to get better at the technique. So Devin, thanks for all that great content.
Well, we've just been lucky to be able to put it out there, and we're really grateful that people have enjoyed it and that it's helped them.
Devin, thanks again for your time today. It's been great talking to you. I almost think like this begs for a follow-up session if you could endure it one of these days.
That's been a common thing because this is a relatively novel topic for a lot of folks, and a lot of people are jumping into it at this point and have lots of questions. And the more questions you get answered, a lot of times the more that they spawn future questions. So
sure, absolutely. Anything else you want to add before we wrap it up?
No, especially if we do a second one down the road, I'm sure there'll be more that comes up.
Okay, great. So thanks everybody for tuning in to our first episode of MidCurrent Interviews Live. We'll be continuing the broadcasts in coming weeks, so check us out on Facebook. You can also watch on our site if you don't have a Facebook account. And please share with your friends so that they know that we're doing these things. It helps everybody. So until next time, try to find some beautiful water and get out there and do a little fishing. Remember, happiness is a wet fly line, or in this case, a wet euro-nymphing leader. Thanks again, Devin. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you, Marshall.
All right.